Hey guys, welcome back to Fiction Flux. Hope you're all doing well. Now let's get into it. She was standing in the rain. That's how everyone who was there would remember it later. Not the fight, not the power, not the moment when everything that had been building for a year finally broke open in the middle of UA's training ground with half the school watching. They remembered the rain and the way she was standing in it. Not dramatically, not the way heroes stood in the rain in posters and broadcasts, the chin up, the wind catching the costume, the specific performed quality of someone who understood they were being watched. She was just standing there, with her notebook open, in the rain, writing, and Todoroki Shoto, who had been described in 3 separate official assessments as emotionally unreachable, was across the training ground looking at her, with an expression that the entire second-year class would spend the following week trying to describe and failing. And Bakugo Katsuki, who had not looked at anything with genuine uncertainty since he was approximately 9 years old, was looking at her too. And Shinso, and Ida, and at least 4 other people who were supposed to be paying attention to the post-mission debrief. All of them watching. All of them already too far into something they hadn't seen coming. And she had no idea. She genuinely, completely, with her whole heart, had absolutely no idea. Because she was writing. And the person she was thinking about while writing was not any of them. But we're not there yet. We need to go back to the beginning. Back to the first day of second year. Back to before the rain and the training ground and the expression on Todoroki's face that nobody had words for. Back to how it started. Which, like most things that mattered, started small. The first day of second year at UA had a different energy than first year. First year was the energy of possibility, everyone arriving uncertain, everyone performing confidence at varying levels of success, everyone secretly convinced they might be the weakest one in the room and hoping nobody noticed. Second year was different. Second year was the energy of people who had survived the first year, who had been through the USJ and the sports festival and the training camp and everything after, who had earned their spots in the room in ways that first-year applications hadn't required. The energy was confident. And then she walked in. Midoriya Izumi, second year, class 2A. Green hair that had grown out over the summer in the specific way of someone who had been too busy training to think about it. Freckles, ink on 2 fingers of her right hand, a backpack that was visibly overfull. The expression of someone who had been awake since before dawn doing something that mattered to her. She walked in and looked around the classroom like she was taking inventory. Not of the people, of the ideas, the way someone looked at a space when they were already thinking about what was going to happen in it. She sat down. She opened a notebook. She started writing before the teacher arrived. Kaminari Denki, who sat 2 seats to her left, leaned over and said, "What are you writing?" She said without looking up, "Adjustments to my left side defensive application. I identified a gap during the summer training sessions. I want to document the correction before the day gets busy." Kaminari said, "It's the first day." She said, "The gap doesn't care what day it is." Kaminari stared at her. He looked at Seiro across the room. Seiro mouthed, "What?" He mouthed back, "I don't know." He looked at her writing. He looked at Seiro again. He mouthed, "She's kind of." Seiro mouthed, "Yeah." They both looked away. She kept writing. She had no idea. The thing about Izumi Midoriya was not the power. Everyone at UA had power. Power was the baseline. Power was the entrance requirement. Power at UA was like being tall at a basketball camp. It was the starting point, not the differentiator. What Izumi had that nobody quite knew how to account for was the attention. She paid it to everything, to everyone. Completely. When she looked at you, she was actually looking at you. When she asked you something, she was actually listening to the answer. When you said something she found interesting, she wrote it down, not to be weird about it, not as a power move, because she was genuinely interested, and writing things down was how she made sure she didn't lose the genuine interest to the noise of everything else. Most people in their lives encountered this quality of attention maybe 3 or 4 times if they were lucky. At UA in the second year, 22 students encountered it daily. This had consequences nobody had planned for. Ida noticed it first. Not romantically, Tenya did not immediately notice things romantically. He noticed them organizationally. He noticed the efficiency of her attention, the way she could be in a conversation with one person and simultaneously track what was happening in the room in a way that wasn't surveillance, it was care. She cared about the room. He noticed this during the first week when she had redirected a training exercise that was going badly by suggesting an adjustment that accounted for everyone's specific capacity and gaps simultaneously. Not her gaps, everyone's. She had mapped the room's capacity and designed a solution around it while he was still organizing his notes on what had gone wrong. He said afterward, "Midoriya, the adjustment you suggested." She said, "Yes." He said, "You had mapped everyone's specific capacity before the exercise began." She said, "I have notebooks about everyone's technique gaps. It's useful for coordination." He said, "You have notebooks about everyone's technique gaps." She said, "Second year is about team effectiveness. Individual capacity is the foundation. The architecture above it is the collaboration. I document both." He said, "Since when?" She said, "First year. The USJ created a gap in my documentation that I've been retrospectively filling. There were things I should have noticed sooner that might have changed the outcome." He looked at her. He said, "You've been retroactively documenting the USJ for accuracy." She said, "The record needs to be accurate. Inaccurate records produce wrong conclusions." He said, "And the wrong conclusions cost people." She said, "Yes." He said, "Midoriya." She said, "Yes." He said, "You are a very unusual person." She said, "I know." She said, "I've been told that before." He said, "In the notebooks." She said, "In the notebooks, yes." He walked away. He thought about the notebooks for the rest of the afternoon, in the specific focused way. He thought about things that had resorted his understanding of a situation. He thought, she has been caring about the safety of everyone in this class since the USJ. He thought she documented the gap because an accurate record was the only responsible response to failure. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he knocked on her door at 7 a.m. with an organized summary of his own first-year incident documentation and said, "I thought a cross-reference might improve accuracy in both records." She opened the door, already awake, already writing, and said, "Come in." He came in. They sat at her desk for 2 hours, cross-referencing incident documentation. It was the most purely satisfying 2 hours he had experienced at UA. He walked out with the specific quality of someone who had just found a frequency they had been looking for. He also walked out with the specific quality of someone who had not fully processed what the finding had meant. That would come later. Shinso Hitoshi arrived at Class 2A through the Hero Course transfer program in Week 2. He arrived with the specific posture of someone who had been told his whole life that his quirk was the wrong kind, and who had subsequently developed an exterior that said, "I know what you're thinking and I find your predictability exhausting." He sat at the back. He did not expect to be spoken to in any meaningful way on the first day. On the first day, she appeared at the back of the classroom during the break between periods, sat in the empty seat beside him, and said, "Your capture technique in the sports festival was the most efficient application of a non-combat classified quirk I've documented. The psychology of the timing is in Notebook 7, but I've been wanting to ask about the specific threshold. When you decide to activate, is it primarily auditory, or is there a secondary trigger?" He stared at her. He said, "You documented my sports festival performance." She said, "I documented everyone's. Yours has its own section." He said, "Its own section." She said, "The quirk application efficiency is significantly higher than the surface classification suggests. The Commission's threat assessment is wrong. I wrote a correction section. It's in the notation." He said, "You wrote a correction to the Commission's threat assessment of my quirk." She said, "The assessment undervalues the tactical application by approximately 60%. It's a classification error. The error produces wrong threat models for anyone facing you in a real situation." He said, "You're saying the Commission's assessment makes me look weaker than I am?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And you wrote a correction?" She said, "In Notebook 7, yes, the threshold question is in Section 4. He looked at her. He said, "The threshold is primarily auditory. There's a secondary attentional trigger, If I have their full attention before the verbal component, it increases activation probability. She was already writing. He said, "You're writing that." She said, "Yes." He said, "Right now." She said, "The data is most accurate immediately. Delayed documentation loses texture." He said, "You said texture." She said, "The specific quality of information, the difference between what happened and how it happened, both matter for accurate documentation." He looked at the notebook. He said, "Nobody has ever asked about the threshold." She said, "The threshold is the most tactically significant variable in your application. Of course it matters." He said, "Of course." She said, "Of course." He looked at her. He said, "Section 4. She said, "Yes." He said, "And section 1 through 3. She said, "The historical development of the quirk application from the sports festival footage, the tactical framework you've developed, the specific ways the commission classification error has affected how people engage with you." He said, "The ways the classification error." She said, "People don't prepare correctly for you because the threat assessment is wrong. That affects how every interaction unfolds. The psychological cost of being chronically underestimated is in section 3. He was very still. He said, "You wrote about the psychological cost." She said, "It's relevant to the full picture. The full picture is more accurate than the tactical picture alone." He said, "That's." He stopped. He said, "Yes." He said, "Section 3 is accurate." She said, "I know." She said it simply. She went back to writing. He sat beside her for the rest of the break. He came back the next day. And the day after. The pattern established itself before he had examined it. He examined it in week 3 and found something he did not have adequate words for and wrote nothing in no notebook, because he was not someone who kept notebooks and instead sat with it in the specific quiet of someone who was used to sitting with things alone. He sat with it. He did not tell anyone. Bakugo's thing was different from everyone else's. Bakugo's thing was always different from everyone else's, because Bakugo related to everything through competition, and competition was the framework through which he processed most significant experiences. He had known her since they were children. That was the complication. He had been carrying the history of that knowledge for years, the complicated, layered, not fully examined history of knowing someone since before you understood what knowing someone meant. He had called her Deku for years. She had taken the name and made it hers. He had watched her do that. He had watched her do that, and he had not known how to feel about it, and so he had filed it under irrelevant, do not examine, focus on training. Second year was where the filing system failed. It failed during a combat exercise in week 4. They were paired against each other. This was deliberate on Aizawa's part. He had paired them before and would again, because the specific dynamic their history produced was the most efficiently revealing test condition for both of them. She fought him differently in second year than first. Not stronger, different. She had been working on the specific adaptation to his approach, not how to overpower it. She was not trying to overpower it. She had been working on how to be unpredictable to it, how to move in ways that his very accurate read on her patterns did not account for. She had been studying his patterns. In the notebooks. He knew this because she told him, directly before the match. She said, "I've been documenting your technique development since first year. The patterns are in notebook 3. I want you to know that so the match is accurate rather than me having an unfair information advantage." He stared at her. He said, "You're telling me you've been analyzing my technique so I can account for it." She said, "The match is more accurate if we're operating with equivalent information. The outcome of an accurate match is more useful data than the outcome of an unbalanced one." He said, "You're not trying to win." She said, "I'm trying to get accurate data on both our applications under matched conditions. That requires equivalent information." He said, "Most people would use the advantage." She said, "Most people aren't interested in accuracy. I am." He said, "You're giving up a competitive advantage for accuracy." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why does accuracy matter more?" She said, "Because the accurate version of me and the accurate version of you are what we both need to train against. The version that wins on information asymmetry is not useful data." He looked at her. He said, "Notebook 3. She said, yes. He said, there's a notebook specifically about my technique. She said, you're the most technically complex application in the class. The notebook is comprehensive. He said, comprehensive. She said, 47 pages currently, I'm still adding to it. He said, 47. She said, you keep developing, the documentation keeps up. He said, you've been writing 47 pages about my technique development. She said, to understand it accurately, yes. He said, and you told me about it before the match. She said, yes. He said, because accuracy matters more than winning. She said, yes. He said, Deku. She said, yes. He said, that's the most Deku thing you've ever done. She said, yes. She said, probably. They fought. It was the most accurate fight either of them had in second year. He won by a margin that was smaller than any previous margin. Afterward, he sat with the 47 pages in his head and the specific texture of fighting someone who had given up an advantage, so the match would be real. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it in the specific focused way. He thought about things that had resorted his understanding of what actually mattered. He thought she didn't want to win unfairly. He thought she wanted the real version. He thought she always wants the real version. He thought about that. He did not tell anyone what he thought about it. He trained harder. She noticed. She added to Notebook 3. Okay, we need to address the question that everyone watching this has been asking since the first scene. Because you've been watching all of this, Ida and the cross-referencing, Shinso and Section 3, Bakugo and 47 pages, the whole accumulating weight of a classroom full of extraordinary people finding their way into something they hadn't planned for, and the question has been building. Who does she love? Because she clearly does not love any of them, not in the returned way, not in the way that makes the thing mutual. She cares about all of them, genuinely, specifically, in the accurate way she cares about everything. The caring is real. But the love is somewhere else. She has been carrying it since before second year started. She has been carrying it in Notebook 20, not the hero analysis notebooks, the other one, the one she keeps separately, the one with the different handwriting, because the different handwriting happens when she is not writing for documentation. She is writing for something else in Notebook 20. We know she has it because in week 6, Uraraka Ochako found her writing in it at 2 in the morning in the common room, with the pen at a speed that was not the analysis speed, and not the processing speed. A third speed. The one that happened when she was writing towards something rather than about something. Uraraka said, "You're awake." She looked up. She said, "Yes." Uraraka said, "It's 2 a.m. She said, "I know." Uraraka said, "Which notebook is that?" She said, 20. Uraraka said, 20 doesn't have a subject label. She said, "No." Uraraka said, "All your other notebooks have subject labels." She said, "Yes." Uraraka sat across from her. She said, "Izumi." She said, "Yes." Uraraka said, "Who's Notebook 20 about?" She said nothing for a moment. She said, "The subject is still developing." Uraraka said, "The subject is a person." She said, "Yes." Uraraka said, "And you're still figuring out what the subject is." She said, "I know what it is. I'm figuring out what to do with it." Uraraka said, "How long?" She said, "Since the end of first year." Uraraka said, "Since the end of first year." She said, "Yes." Uraraka said, "And you've been writing about it for a year without telling anyone." She said, "The documentation is private." Uraraka said, "Izumi?" She said, "Yes." Uraraka said, "Does the person know?" A long pause. She said, "No." Uraraka said, "Are you going to tell them?" She said, "I'm working on the architecture of how." Uraraka said, "You're planning how to tell someone you love them using an architecture." She said, "I don't know how to do it without the architecture. The direct version feels too large without a framework." Uraraka put her chin in her hands. She said, "You're the smartest person I know." She said, "Thank you." Uraraka said, and you're completely lost. She said, yes. She said, that's accurate. Uraraka said, who is it? She said, Notebook 20 is private. Uraraka said, I'm your best friend. She said, Notebook 20 is private. Uraraka said, Izumi. She said, the subject is developing. Uraraka said, you said you know what it is. She said, I know what it is. The subject is still developing. Those are different things. Uraraka looked at her. She said, one clue. She said, no. Uraraka said, one, I'll stop asking. She looked at Notebook 20. She said, the person makes me want to write at the third speed. Uraraka said, what's the third speed? She said, I don't have a name for it. It's the speed that happens when I'm not documenting something and not processing something, when I'm moving towards something. Uraraka said, the person makes you move towards something. She said, yes. Uraraka said, in the writing. She said, yes. Uraraka said, okay. She said, okay. Uraraka said, I'll stop asking, but Izumi? She said, yes. Uraraka said, the architecture, whatever you build it out of. She said, yes. Uraraka said, build it soon. She said, yes. She looked at Notebook 20. She said, I know. Week 8 was the week everyone's something got harder to manage. Not because anything dramatic happened, because things that had been building for 8 weeks had been building for 8 weeks, and that was a long time for something to build without resolution. Ida had started arriving at the same study table as her in the evenings, not to cross-reference documentation, just to be in the same space. He had examined this and understood what it represented, and had subsequently become extremely formal in all their interactions, because formality was his mechanism for managing things that exceeded his organizational framework. She had noticed the formality. She had written about it. She had concluded something has shifted in Ida-kun's approach. The formality is a management mechanism. The thing being managed is in the real things category. She had written, I hope I haven't done something that made him uncomfortable. She had drawn a star. This was the most Izumi thing possible. She had correctly identified that something was happening and had concluded it might be her fault, and had written about hopping she hadn't hurt him. She was so completely unaware of what was actually happening. Shinso had started sitting closer in the classroom. Not next to her, he was not someone who did things that obviously. Closer, one seat to the left rather than the far back. A specific gravitational drift that nobody commented on because nobody wanted to be the person who commented on Shinso doing anything. He had examined this too. He examined things, it was his quality. He had concluded, the drift is real and represents something I have not finished understanding. Understanding incomplete situations is uncomfortable. I will continue sitting in the adjusted position while I finish understanding. He continued sitting in the adjusted position. She had noticed. She had written, Shinso-kun has moved one seat closer. The pattern is consistent. I don't know what the pattern represents. The documentation is accurate. She had not drawn a conclusion. She was good at documenting without drawing wrong conclusions. She was less good at drawing right ones about herself. And Bakugo. Bakugo was the most interesting one, because Bakugo had the least tolerance for things he couldn't name. He had been operating in the specific tension of someone who knew something was true, and refused to examine it, because examining it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would require. He did not finish this thought. He trained harder. He added to her 47 pages. In week 8, during a joint training exercise, she had covered his left side without being asked, had been in position before the threat had fully materialized, had been there because she had studied the exercise parameters and mapped the likely attack vectors, and had simply been where she needed to be. He had been covered before he needed to be covered. He had turned and looked at her. She had already moved to the next position. He had watched her move to the next position, with the specific expression that his classmates had been trying to name since the sports festival, and still couldn't. He added to her 47 pages. He added 3 pages. He did not tell anyone what those 3 pages contained. Week 9 was when the person from Notebook 20 arrived. Not literally, they had been there. They had been in the class and the training and the daily fabric of UA since before second year started. But week 9 was when they arrived in the way that mattered. In the specific way that made Notebook 20 go from cautious and carefully framed to the third speed, all the way. It was during the overnight hero simulation, the multi-day exercise in a controlled urban environment, that the second-year curriculum used to test sustained performance under real condition approximations. 40 hours in a simulated city with real stakes for the scenario outcomes. She had been operating continuously for 31 hours when it happened. She was in the simulation's eastern district, running a solo extraction from a building that had been designated a civilian cluster zone. She had been working continuously for so long that the processing speed had taken over from the analysis speed, and she was operating on something deeper than planning, the specific embodied knowledge that years of training produced, the thing that knew what to do before the thinking caught up. She was moving through the building's third floor when the structural collapse hit. Not the simulated kind. An actual structural failure in the simulated environment, the kind that the exercise designers had not planned for, and which produced a real danger situation inside an exercise context. She had been in the wrong position. She had known it the moment the ceiling started its motion. And then she hadn't been in the wrong position anymore because someone had been there. Had been there before she fully processed the ceiling's motion. Had been there in the specific way of someone who had mapped the building's structural vulnerabilities before entering it and had been tracking her position and had made a calculation about the failure point and had moved. She found herself in the cleared space. She looked up. She said, "You were tracking the structural vulnerabilities." The person said, "I always track the structural vulnerabilities." She said, "You mapped my position." The person said, "I map everyone's position." She said, "But you were already moving." The person said, "Yes." She said, "Before the ceiling moved." The person said, "The stress patterns were visible, it was going to happen." She said, "You saw the stress patterns." The person said, "Yes." She said, "And you moved toward me." A pause. The person said, "Yes." She said, "Before it happened." The person said, "Yes." She looked at them. The person looked back. The simulation continued around them. She said, "Thank you." The person said, "Yes." She opened Notebook 20 in her head. She wrote at the third speed. She did not write words. The third speed was not words yet. It was the specific quality of something arriving. The rain scene. Week 11. The post-mission debrief in the outdoor training ground. Rain. The instructor was reviewing the mission outcomes. She was writing. Her pen was at the third speed, and her expression was the one she had when she was moving towards something in the writing, and she was not fully aware of the rain. 22 people were at varying stages of noticing. Ida was trying to focus on the debrief and redirecting his attention every 40 seconds. Shinso had stopped pretending he was taking notes and was watching with the expression he had when something exceeded his current framework. Kaminari and Siro had exchanged 11 silent looks. Bakugo was looking at her with the expression that still had no name. And the person from Notebook 20 was standing at the edge of the group. Watching the rain. Watching her in the rain. With the expression of someone who had been watching structural vulnerabilities and calculating positions for years and had finally stopped calculating and was just watching. She felt it. She looked up from the notebook. She looked at the group. Her eyes found the person from Notebook 20. The person from Notebook 20 looked back. Nobody else caught the specific quality of the moment between those two looks. Uraraka did. Uraraka had been watching for 8 weeks for exactly this moment. She saw it. She wrote nothing because she had no notebook, but she filed it in the category of confirmed hypotheses and felt something warm and complicated and entirely correct about the warmth. She looked at the rest of the group. She looked at Bakugo's expression. She looked at Ida's formal posture. She looked at Shinso's non-note-taking. She thought, "Oh no." She thought, "Oh no, oh no, oh no." She thought, "This is going to be so messy." It was messy. Week 12 was the mess. Not dramatically. Real messes were never as clean as the dramatic kind. Week 12 was the mess of 7 people independently arriving at the conclusion that something was happening and none of them communicating with each other about it because nobody wanted to be the person who said it first. Kaminari said it first. He said it to Zero in the hallway on a Wednesday afternoon. He said, "Bro." Zero said, "I know." Kaminari said, "Everyone is." Zero said, "I know." Kaminari said, "And she has no." Zero said, "Absolutely none." Kaminari said, "This is like a situation." Zero said, "This has been a situation since week 1. Kaminari said, "I thought it was just me." Zero said, "It's not just you." Kaminari said, "It's Ida." Zero said, "Yes." Kaminari said, "And Shinso." Zero said, "Yes." Kaminari said, "And?" Zero said, "Don't say Bakugo." Kaminari said, "I wasn't going to say Bakugo." Zero said, "Good." Kaminari said, "I was going to say Bakugo." Zero said, "Kaminari." Kaminari said, "Bro was cooked from the 47 pages. He wrote 47 pages." Zero said, "We don't know that." Kaminari said, "We absolutely know that." Zero said, "Yes." He said, "We absolutely know that." They stood in the hallway. Kaminari said, "And she has no idea." Zero said, "None." Kaminari said, "Because she's." Zero said, "In Notebook 20. Kaminari said, "How do you know about Notebook 20? Zero said, "Uraraka told me some of it." Kaminari said, "Uraraka knows." Zero said, "Yes." Kaminari said, "Who does Notebook 20 have?" Zero said, "She didn't tell me that part." Kaminari said, "But there's a person." Zero said, "There's a person." Kaminari said, "And she's had it for a year." Zero said, "A year." Kaminari said, "And none of the people who are." Zero said, "None of them." Kaminari said, "This is wild." Zero said, "This is very wild." Kaminari said, "What do we do?" Zero said, "We do nothing." Kaminari said, "Nothing." Zero said, "Nothing." Kaminari said, "And watch it all unfold." Zero said, "And watch it all unfold, yes." Kaminari said, "That feels bad." Zero said, "Yes, but it's the correct answer." Kaminari said, "Yes." He said, "It is." The villain attack happened in week 13. And I know, of course the villain attack happened. You cannot have 12 weeks of slow-building tension and complicated feelings, and rainy training grounds and Notebook 20, without the universe eventually demanding a crisis that strips everything down to what it actually is. The universe delivered. The attack was not on UA directly. It was on a civilian area 3 blocks from the school during a training exercise that had taken the second-year class into the district. A coordinated assault by a group that had been planning for months, not against the heroes specifically, but against the area's infrastructure, which had the specific cascading effect of putting a significant number of civilians in immediate danger simultaneously. Too many points of danger for the response to cover cleanly. She assessed this in 4 seconds. She said to Ida, "East Cluster, maximum coordination, you're fastest." She said to Shinso, "The coordination point is the secondary building. If you can get to them before they split, you can collapse the whole operation." She said to Kaminari, "The power grid, you know what needs to happen." She said to Bakugo, "Cover, everything else is support for the extraction, you're the cover." She was already moving. Not toward the largest threat. Toward the place where the coverage was thinnest. The specific point in the operation that she had mapped in the first 4 seconds, where the response had the worst geometry, where the most people were in danger with the least available response. She went there alone. She went there because it needed her specifically, and because going there alone was the correct call given the information available, and because she was not afraid. Not performing not afraid, actually not afraid. The specific quality of someone who had calculated the cost and decided it was acceptable. The people who watched her go, Bakugo specifically, who had the sharpest read on her of anyone in the group, and knew what the move to the thinly covered point meant, felt something. Bakugo felt it most acutely. He felt it in the specific place that the 47 pages had been accumulating toward, without him examining what they were accumulating toward. He said, "Don't." She was already past hearing range. He said it anyway. He covered everything she had assigned him to cover, and then he covered her position too. The position she had taken, the thin point, from a distance that required him to extend his range, and that was the correct decision because she was good and capable, and had calculated correctly, and still the cover was correct. He covered her. She handled the thin point. 17 minutes. Everyone got out. The aftermath was the specific quiet of a crisis correctly managed, not the dramatic victory quiet of a completed final battle, the working quiet of people who had done the job and were now doing the documentation. She was sitting on a piece of debris writing in notebook 45 when Bakugo appeared. He said nothing for a moment. She said, "The coverage you added was correct. I had calculated for the alternative, but the coverage improved the geometry significantly." He said, "I know." She said, "The decision to extend the range was technically above the standard parameters." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm noting it as a significant positive variance." He said, "Deku." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to say something and you're going to write it down." She said, "Yes." He said, "You keep going to the thin point." She said, "The thin point is where the coverage matters most." He said, "Yes." He said, "And I keep covering you." She said, "Yes." He said, "And that's been true since first year." She said, "Yes." He said, "And I've been writing about your technique gaps for 47 pages." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the 47 pages stopped being about technique gaps somewhere in the middle." She was very still. He said, "And I don't know when it stopped being about technique gaps, but it did." She said, "Katsuki." His name, for the first time since they were children. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "I have to tell you something." He said, "Yes." She said, "The documentation I have on you is the most extensive in all the notebooks." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the 47 pages, I know they stopped being about technique gaps too." He said, "Deku." She said, "And I need you to know that I see that, and I." She stopped. He said, "And." She said, "And I have notebook 20. He was quiet. He said, "What's notebook 20? She said, "The notebook without a subject label." He said, "And it has a subject?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And the subject isn't me?" She said it directly. She said, "No." She said, "And I'm sorry, because what you just said is in the permanent record and it matters, and the caring is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't real." He said, "But notebook 20. She said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "How long?" She said, "Since the end of first year." He processed this. He said, "A year." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you've been writing about it for a year?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And the person in notebook 20? She said, "Doesn't know yet." He looked at her. He said, "Deku." She said, "Yes." He said, "You're telling me they don't know?" She said, "I've been working on the architecture." He said, "The architecture?" She said, "Of how to say it." He made a sound. Not a laugh exactly. The sound of someone encountering something so specifically the other person that the combination of recognition and pain produced something that couldn't be categorized as either laughing or crying. He said, "The architecture." She said, "Yes." He said, "And in the meantime?" She said, "In the meantime, I've been watching everyone build their own things, and I've been worried about hurting people, and I've been writing notebook 20 at 2 in the morning." He said, "You should tell them." She said, "I know." He said, "Today." She said, "The architecture isn't." He said, "Deku." She said, "Yes." He said, "The architecture is a delay mechanism. You know that?" She said, "Yes." She said, "I know that." He said, "So tell them." She said, "Today." He said, yes. He said, today. He stood up. He looked at her with the expression that still had no clean name, but which she understood for the first time looking at it directly. She said, Katsuki. He said, yeah. She said, the 47 pages. He said, yes. She said, I'm going to keep writing them. He said, I know. She said, because you keep developing. He said, I know. She said, and the documentation matters. He said, yes. He said, it does. He walked away. She sat with the notebook open. She did not write for a moment. She thought about what he had said. Today. She thought, yes. She thought, today. She opened notebook 20. She wrote the last planning entry. She wrote, the architecture is complete. The delay is a delay mechanism. The delay ends today. She drew a star. She drew 6 more. 7 stars. She wrote 7, 1 for each year since we met. 1 for the structural vulnerability he saw that I didn't. 1 for him moving before the ceiling moved. 1 for the 3rd speed. 1 for notebook 20's year of writing. 1 for the rain. 1 for today. She looked at 7 stars. She said, yes. That's right. She found them where she had calculated they would be. The eastern edge of the exercise area. The position they always took after a significant operation. The specific decompression location of someone who needed to process events through space and quiet rather than conversation. She had documented this in Notebook 23. She had documented it as characteristic post-operation behavior. The processing happens in the quiet. The quiet is in specific locations. The locations are consistent. She walked to the location. They were there. She said, I have something to say. They said, I know. She said, you know. They said, you have notebook 20 open. She looked at the notebook in her hands. She said, I didn't realize. They said, you always hold it differently than the other notebooks. She said, I hold it differently. They said, yes, more carefully. She said, I didn't know that. They said, I know. She said, how long have you known? They said, long enough. She said, notebook 20 is. They said, yes. She said, I've been trying to build the architecture. They said, I know. She said, how do you know? They said, I've been watching you try to build it. The watching was not difficult. You document things. The documentation has a direction. The direction was visible. She said, you saw the direction. They said, yes. She said, and you? They said, and I've been tracking structural vulnerabilities and calculating positions and moving before ceilings moved. She said, for me? They said, yes. She said, because? They said, yes. She said, say it. They said, the 3rd speed. She said, yes. They said, you write at a 3rd speed when you're moving towards something. She said, yes. They said, I've seen it for a year. She said, and you? They said, I don't keep notebooks, but if I did. She said, yes. They said, the 3rd speed would be the whole notebook. She looked at them. They looked at her. She said, who are you in notebook 20? They said, tell me. She opened the notebook. She said, the person who saw the stress patterns before the ceiling moved. The person who mapped my position. The person who makes me write at the 3rd speed and doesn't know what the 3rd speed is, but produces it anyway. She said, the person who is the architecture's whole reason. She said, the person I've been building toward for a year. She said, you. They said, is you me? She said, yes. They said, I've been here. She said, I know. They said, I've been here the whole time. She said, I know. She said, I'm sorry it took me a year to build the architecture. They said, don't be sorry. She said, why not? They said, because the architecture is yours, and what you build correctly is worth the time it takes to build correctly. She said, that's. She stopped. She said, that's the most accurate thing anyone has said to me. They said, I know you, accurate things are the ones that land. She said, yes. She said, "They are." She looked at them. They looked at her. The eastern edge of the exercise area was quiet in the way it was always quiet after crisis. The settling quiet, the honest quiet, the quiet that existed when everything that could happen had happened, and what was left was what was real. She said, "Notebook 20 has a title now." They said, "What is it?" She said, "The whole thing." They said, "The whole thing." She said, "Yes." She said, "Because that's what it is." She said, "The whole thing." They said, "Yes." They said, "It is." And in the specific quiet of the eastern edge, with the crisis managed and the documentation complete, and 7 stars on a page she had been writing for a year, 2 people stood in the only position that had always been available and finally occupied it. Todoroki Shoto. That was the answer. That was Notebook 20's person. The one who had seen stress patterns no one else saw, who had moved before the ceiling moved, who had been tracking her position since the first year not as analysis, but as the thing that became analysis when you gave it a framework, because the framework was safer than the real name. The one whose quiet was the same quality as her quiet. The one who processed things in space and silence. The one who had a specific decompression location and a consistent pattern and a third speed of his own that he expressed not in writing, but in the specific way he occupied the same space as the people who mattered to him. All the way present. Without performing it. She had seen it in week 1. She had written it in Notebook 20 on the 3rd day. She had been building the architecture for a year because the architecture required accuracy and accuracy required the full picture, and the full picture was the most significant thing she had ever tried to document, and she had needed the whole year to document it correctly. She had been right to take the year. The architecture held. It was built on the correct foundation. The rest of the class found out in pieces. Not through an announcement. Real things didn't announce themselves. Through the specific gradual visibility of 2 people who had stopped managing the something between them and were just in it. Uraraka found out first because she had known about Notebook 20 for 8 weeks and had a confirmed hypothesis and said, "Finally." She said it at a volume that made 4 nearby people turn around. She said it without apology. She had waited 8 weeks. She was allowed to say finally. Kaminari found out through Zero, who found out through Uraraka, and he said, "Wait, him." Zero said, "Yes." He said, "The stress patterns guy." Zero said, "Yes." He said, "He moved before the ceiling moved." Zero said, "Yes." He said, and she wrote about it in Notebook 20. Zero said, "For a year." He said, "For a year." Zero said, "Yes." He said, "That's actually." He said, "Okay, yeah." He said, "That tracks." He said, "That completely tracks." Shinso found out and did not say anything. He processed it in the specific quiet he used for significant things. He sat with it for 2 days. Then he found a different seat, not the adjusted position, a new one that was just his, that didn't have a gravitational drift toward anything. He felt the specific quiet of something resolved. He continued sitting in the new position. It was a good position. Ida found out and immediately became more formal than he had ever been, for approximately 4 hours, and then he went to her and said, "I want to say something directly." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm glad the architecture is complete." She looked at him. He said, "The structure is more stable when all the load-bearing elements are correctly placed." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is." She said, "Tenure." He said, "Yes." She said, "The cross-referencing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to keep doing it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I thought you might." She said, "The accurate record is better with both perspectives." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." He said, "Midoriya." She said, "Yes." He said, "The load-bearing list." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm on it." She said, "You've been on it since the cross-referencing." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He walked away. He was less formal after that. Just the right amount of formal. Which for Ada was quite a lot of formal. but the right amount. Bakugo found out and said nothing. He trained. He came to her 3 days later with notebook 48, 3 new pages of technique gap documentation, and put it on her desk and walked away. She looked at the 3 pages. She added them to the documentation. She wrote, Bakugo-kun added 3 pages to the technique gap documentation. The documentation continues. The connection continues. Both things are real simultaneously. She drew a star. She looked at it. She drew 2 more. 3. She wrote 3, 1 for the 47 pages, 1 for the 3 new pages, 1 for the ongoing. She looked at 3 stars. She said, yes. That's right. And then there is the last scene. The one that feels like the end of an anime movie. Because every good anime movie has one. The scene after the crisis and the confession and the revelation and the mess and the resolution. The scene that is quiet and specific and entirely itself. She was on the roof. Not the training ground, not the library, the roof. The specific rooftop she had been going to since first year when the notebooks needed the kind of thinking that required height and open air. He was there. He had found the roof in first year too, for the same reason, the space and the quiet. They had both been going there independently for a year. Neither of them had known the other was also going there until week 14, when they had arrived simultaneously for the first time. They had looked at each other. She had said, "You come here." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Since when?" He had said, "First year." She had said, "Me too." He had said, "Yes, I know." She had said, "You knew I came here." He had said, "The notebook is in a different position when you've been on the roof." She had said, "You noticed how I carry the notebook." He had said, "I notice things, differently from you, but still." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "You do." Now, week 15. Both of them on the roof at the same time, intentionally for the first time. The city was doing what cities did in the evening, the specific transition from day to night that was both ordinary and not depending on where you were when it happened. They were in the right place. She had notebook 20 open. She was writing at the 3rd speed. He was not writing. He was being in the space the way he was in spaces that mattered, fully, without performing it all the way in. She wrote for a while. He watched the city. She said, "I finished the architecture." He said, "Yes." She said, "The whole notebook." He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to know what it says?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "It says that the person who saw the stress patterns before the ceiling moved has been seeing the stress patterns in everything since first year, that the position calculation was not tactical, that the ceiling move was a year after the first time, and the first time was something else, not a structural vulnerability, but a person specifically, and the mapping of that person's position in every room they were both in." She said, "It says that the 3rd speed arrived when I understood what the mapping was for." He said, "What was it for?" She said, "Not documentation." He said, "No." She said, "Not analysis." He said, "No." She said, "Something else." He said, "Yes." She said, "Say it." He said, "I mapped your position because knowing where you were was the thing that made the space make sense." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "That's the most precise thing anyone has ever said to me." He said, "I know you, precise things are the ones that land." She said, "Yes." She said, "They are." She closed notebook 20. She looked at it. She said, "The architecture is complete." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the foundation is accurate." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the load-bearing elements are correctly placed." He said, "Yes." He said, "And the building is." She said, "Ongoing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The ongoing is the whole thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "I've been writing toward it for a year." He said, "I know." She said, "And you've been in every entry." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Shoto." He said, "Yes." She said, "The roof." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad we're both here." He said, "Yes." He said, "So am I." The city transitioned from day to night. The roof held them. The notebook was closed. The building was ongoing. The both things held. The third speed was exactly what it was. And two people who had been mapping each other's positions for a year stood in the one place that had always been available and were finally, completely, accurately there. Together, all the way in. The whole thing. And that is the complete story of Class 2, a second year. Of everyone finding their way into something they didn't plan. Of Ida and the cross-referencing. Of Shinso and Section 3. Of Bakugo and 47 pages and 3 more. Of Kaminari and Zero watching it all unfold. Of Uraraka saying finally at a volume that made people turn around. Of Notebook 20 and the third speed, and the architecture that took a year, and the year being worth it. Of Todoroki Shoto, who moved before the ceiling moved. Of Izumi Midoriya, who was the last one to know what everyone else could see. Who wrote it all down. Who built it correctly. Who got it right. No cap, this is the most complete and earned love story fiction Flux has ever told. And every notebook proved it. Every single one. If you made it to the very end of this complete story, you are absolutely Fiction Flux family, and we love you for being here. Please subscribe and hit that like button and share this video with every single anime fan you know, because every share helps us reach more people who love these stories. Drop in the comments who you thought Notebook 20 was about and what story you want next. We make these for you. See you in the next one.